What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel Messianic Me TV. In this video we're gonna be talking about something that is quite near and dear to me and I find quite interesting. And I'm willing to say you may find it interesting yourself. And that is the topic of the temple, the sacrifice, and the high priest. But before we go ahead and dig into the video, if you're not yet part of the family, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because in this channel we talk all things Torah, Halakha, Jewish thought, and more. If you end up enjoying this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up because it really does help the video and the channel. And if you find that the video is share-worthy, make sure you share it with your friends and family. Alright, let's go. Let's begin with the temple. The temple in Jerusalem, as seen in the scriptures, was central and absolutely essential for the worship of the people of Israel. It was not just a place where pilgrims would come from all corners of the Jewish world to worship. It was also the place where the people of God would come to offer sacrifices for their individual sins, and where the high priest would offer a sacrifice once a year in the day of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, for the atonement of the sins of the entire nation. But even more wonderful than all that, that was the place where the presence of God would dwell amongst men. It was a place where God would reveal himself with a potency so strong that anyone who would enter the Holy of Holies, if found not worthy, would instantly die. With all factors considered, it cannot be overstated that this place was no ordinary place, but it was indeed the house of God. Yet as special as this place was, twice it was encountered with the horrible fate of destruction at the hands of the enemies of Israel. The first of these horrid episodes was seen in the year 586 BC. At the hands of the Babylonians, the temple saw itself all but erased from history, with only ruins left behind and the Hebrew people taken captive to Babylon. This was an absolute tragedy in the history of Israel. Thankfully, by the grace of God, the king Cyrus in Babylon, after the empire had fallen the year before, decided that it was time for the building to be rebuilt again and the temple to be given to the people of Israel. While it took several years for the construction of the temple to be actually completed, it's interesting to note that it took a Yovel, a jubilee, for it to be actually reinstated again. Now, just as a little side note, Yovel, as we see in scripture, is a period of 50 years. After 50 years, land is returned to those who once owned it. Similarly, once the Israelites had lost the temple, 50 years later, their land is given back to them. This new temple, or as we know it today, the Second Temple, lived a beautiful life for a couple of centuries, but in the year 70 AD, it once again was faced with the enemies of Israel and faced destruction. We are able to see that the temple, when it was destroyed, seemed quite odd to the Romans. And that is because of the fact that when these Roman officials came in and conquered, they ended up entering into what is known as the Holy of Holies. This is basically the center point of the temple. What was shocking about this to the Romans is the fact that this, the most holy place, was found empty. As you and I know, the previous temple in the same spot contained something quite special, and that is the Ark of the Covenant. Unfortunately, after the temple was rebuilt, that was no longer there. But scriptures claim that somehow this temple would be greater than the previous. But what made it more special? Yeshua lets us know through his words why it was more special, and that is the fact that he was there. He taught there often. And if the king, the Messiah, and the new temple himself in the flesh was there, that would definitely make that temple greater and more glorious than the previous. But there is one more point that I want to bring. Another extra biblical source, specifically Jewish writings, in the Talmud, Tractate Yoma 39b, we see something quite interesting. A man of the priestly caste that is recorded to have even rebuked the gates at the temple, because 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the gates would open. And he is recorded to have said, "Why do you tremble in fear? I know your destruction will come, but it is not here yet." Not only that, but in this specific section of the Talmud, we see a couple of factors that are quite interesting. It tells us that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the lot for God that should have landed on the right hand of the priest no longer did so. Additionally, we see that the crimson wool that was tied to the head of the goat that was sent for Azazel would not become white, but rather remain crimson. And while the Talmud refuses to acknowledge this, history shows us that at this point, 40 years before the destruction of the temple, Yeshua began his ministry. Yet the Talmud records that at this very point in time, the temple sacrifices were no longer valid. Now let's go ahead and proceed into the second phase of this video, the sacrifice. Just as the temple was a cornerstone in the life of believers in the Creator of the world, so was the sacrificial system. And we see hints to this system all the way from the very beginning. And when I say the beginning, I mean Bereshit, Genesis. In the book of Genesis chapter 3, we see that God himself covered Adam and Eve after they had sinned through the sacrifice of an animal, and their skin physically ended up covering for their error. Later on, as we proceed in time, we look at the sacrifices that were offered by Moshe to cover the people of Israel when the covenant was finally presented for the people. When we look at the Torah, we see that the blood of these sacrifices that were offered were used by Moshe to sprinkle the people of Israel to initiate this covenant. Later, we frequently see that these sacrifices were used for the atonement and forgiveness of sins throughout the history of Israel while the temple stood. And we can see it in a very clear way that blood was absolutely essential when it came to forgiveness and atonement, as we can see in the book of Vayikra, or Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11. Here we see that God tells us that the life is in the blood, and this blood was used for the atonement of the sins of the people. So if we believe that the temple itself was important, we also believe in the crucial aspect of the importance of the sacrifices and the blood that was spilled. While there were sacrifices offered for the sake of thanksgiving, many of the sacrifices, if not the majority, were done for the sake of forgiveness and for atonement for the sins of the people of Israel. But this also puts a specific predicament for us. Just like the temple was destroyed and it no longer exists, we are faced with a similar dilemma when we know that the temple sacrifices are no longer being kept. But without Yeshua, it leads us to ask, what of the sacrifices? What do we do now? Jewish sources record that Rabbi Yehoshua, who was a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, was troubled at the destruction of the temple. To this cry, Rabbi Yochanan says that now they will have a new way of presenting sacrifice. This would be the way of good deeds. This is why in modern Judaism we can now see that the substitution for the sacrificial system are acts of charity, obeying commandments, and prayer. Yet while these things may seem nice at the surface level, when we look deep, we see that the Torah itself never sanctions this, because the system which God himself had offered for the forgiveness of sin and for the atonement of the people was a blood sacrifice system. Needless to say that this offer that was presented by the rabbis was nowhere found in Torah. Some rabbis would claim that the substitution for the blood sacrifice with prayer was actually sanctioned by the Tanakh. Because in scripture we see situations such as what we see with Daniel, when he was taken out of the land of Israel, what we know as the Galuth, and they were taken to Babylon, he would pray towards the temple 3 times a day and God would hear his call. We see this also in the book of 1 Kings. However, we see that there was something very peculiar about these situations. Number one, it was the fact that the temple was still at that site, though probably quite demolished, but still there. Not only this, and more importantly, this was only a short period of time in which God allowed this to happen for the sake of the people. But they continually sought after God, and 50 years later, as we saw before, a Yovel later, God uses King Cyrus to begin once again the construction of the temple. But that was then. What of now? Though modern Judaism has many beauties, one thing seems to be very terribly flawed, and that is the fact that we have completely ignored the Torah, which we love so much, and it tells us to continue in the sacrificial system, yet we don't have it. I don't know about you, but I refuse to believe that God would just leave us in pending, abandoned without a system which He Himself established. But now this leads me to the next part, the high priest. Just as the temple was essential for the worship of the people of Israel, and the sacrificial system part of it, the role of the high priest was absolutely essential. While the priestly class had the responsibility of presenting the sacrifices of the people of Israel on a daily basis for the forgiveness of sin, the high priest had an even more important role, and that is the fact that once a year in the day of Yom Kippur, or as we know it in English, the Day of Atonement, he would offer a special sacrifice. This one sacrifice was not made for the atonement of one sin or the forgiveness of one sin. Rather, it was offered to God for the forgiveness and atonement for the entire nation of Israel. This right here should let us know that the role of the high priest was absolutely critical, because it was the high priest who would risk his life once a year to enter the Holy of Holies. Again, this is the place where the glory of God would reside in its most potent form. Back in the days of the tabernacle, the scriptures record that in this site was the place where the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day would completely cover and overwhelm the Holy of Holies. It rested upon the Ark of the Covenant. And then at the time of the first temple, it was the same. And then in the time of the second temple, still the presence of God came. But in the most beautiful form that it ever revealed itself was by God revealing Himself in the flesh through Yeshua HaMashiach as He walked and taught right there in the temple. Now I know that in this video I've covered very deep topics in a very surface level, but I'm sure that you can get the points. And though we may argue about interpretation here and there, you see this, you see that, the reason why I wanted to make this video is for us to take a look at this with honest eyes. If you're not a believer in Yeshua, I want you to really consider the fact that the first temple was destroyed, rebuilt again, but then almost 2,000 years it has not been rebuilt. And this destruction happened in the year 70 AD. 40 years before that, Yeshua began his ministry. And if you know anything about biblical times, you know that 40 years is significant. 40 years is the exact amount of time that the people of Israel wandered in the wilderness before they ended up at the promised land. And 40 years after Yeshua had come, we were left in a spiritual wilderness where God gave us the opportunity to either accept Him or complain to the salvation that He had given us. And I feel that unfortunately the majority of our people have been complaining about what He gave us through Yeshua and have instead turned to the rabbis for the solution. A solution that has left us without a temple, without a sacrifice, and without a high priest. But if you are a believer in Yeshua, I want you to also look at these things and to dig deeper into them, that you may be strengthened in faith, recognizing that our Messiah, which is God revealed in the flesh, has offered a solution for these seemingly crippling situations. I realize this video is probably gonna open up a floodgate of questions. But that's why we have the comment section below, so please leave your comments and questions down there. Of course, let's try to keep them civil. I know that this is a very deep topic, and I'm also going to try to do a little live stream to continue this, so make sure you stay tuned for that. In any case, I just want to thank you all for your time. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Have a blessed week. Shalom.